it's 8:31. I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. Well, we have this training recorded, and so for those of your colleagues who are not able to attend, we'll make sure that we send this link out to Kevin and he can get this out to you at your school sites. So let's go ahead and get started. My name is Momi Tu'ua, and I am the Equity Specialist at the Utah State Board of Education. Welcome to our 504 training this morning, and we're happy to join you via WebEx. This is Betty Sue Hinkson. She is the state school nurse, and she will also be presenting this morning to you. Amanda Charlesworth is our staff support, and she is managing the chat part of our training. So as we are presenting, when you have questions, she will go ahead and ask us the questions. We also have sound, right? You should. And if we don't, go ahead and use the chat feature. But we should have sound as well, where if you have a question, you can raise your hand or ask. Also, I'd like to thank Jerry Record, who is our media specialist here at USBE, who keeps us updated and informed as to what camera we need to look at and which monitor. So we're happy to all be here to provide you the support regarding Section 504. Okay, so I'm not sure where we are as far as our expertise in Section 504, so I've got some slides that will give us a baseline foundation, as well as introduce to you a state law and how it's affected our students receiving 504 accommodations at our school districts and within our schools. But briefly, to let you know, Section 504 is a civil rights law that covers students with disabilities, and it actually goes hand in hand with the American Disabilities Act, which is all-encompassing in public areas or even in private areas where access for people with disabilities are provided. And then we also look at 504s in the education realm, particular to our students with disabilities accessing their general education. And that is a distinction that 504 students have versus our students who are receiving special education services. And so we'll go into further detail about that. And basically, it prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in all school-sponsored programs with schools that are receiving federal funding, which all of our public schools are, including our charter schools. And really, Section 504, it talks about the students' access to their general education. And it's there to level the playing field. It's not to give students an advantage, but the ability to access their education as all other students, even without disabilities, are able to do. So I wanted to talk to you about how our federal laws are set up, and if they're clarify as to whether or not there's a funding stream that comes from the federal government specific to Section 504. So my first question is there current funding from the federal government? And the answer is no. Currently, there's no funding, and there never has been for Section 504. My next question to you is, are there any states whose legislators have provided line item funding for Section 504 students? What do you think the answer is? The answer is no, and not yet, right? Kevin, did you want to say something?
No, I was just going to say that same thing. It mentioned, I know the legislature had been looking at that, so I knew there was none, but there could be some coming up.
Yes, there is funding coming up. And so Utah actually is the flagship state where our legislators are looking at line item funding for our LEAs who are providing services whose expenditures are exceeding the 150% of the WPU. And so this was a law that was introduced and passed this year in 2017 February, where that a determination as to how much funding will be allocated to our LEAs to recoup some of the costs for providing accommodations to our 504 students. So here's the bill, and basically it's saying that they want to collect data on students receiving 504 accommodations, and they also want to look at the types of services they are receiving. And so they gave our state, Utah State Board of Education, the powers to create board rule regarding this law. And so there's two parts to this board rule. The first part talks about LEAs reporting through their student information system of not only their students who are receiving 504 services, because that's already built into your SISs, right? And with Iron School District, is it Aspire that you use or Power School? What is it, your SIS system that
We
you
use Power School.
Power School. So there's an indicator right now, I believe, that where you at your school site, you're able to click that your student is, a particular student is receiving 504 services. Now, what our IT people have done is they built parameters where your SIS system is going to expand that, where there's going to be, let's see, 9 disability categories where now you're identifying the student receiving 504 accommodations while also clicking on one or more of these 9 different categories where your student qualifies. Now, we have your IT peeps that it's going to take a while. So I don't know where Iron School District is on this, but we understand that this is going to take some time. And I presented at your, or not at your, but at USBE's data conference last month. I'm not sure if your IT people attended, but the information in building those parameters went out to all LEAs. And so eventually, hopefully during this year, you at the school site are able to mark the entrance and exit dates of your 504 students, and then you're able to mark the disability category or categories of each of your students. And that is written into board rule. The second part of the board rule, it speaks to the information that your business administrators, and I believe, Kevin, that you along with your site administrators at each of your schools are working to collect data on your 504 students to see what those costs are, if any, that are expended to provide accommodations. And that report is, I sent out a report to all business administrators and to 504 coordinators. It's a huge spreadsheet where you will need to identify the disability category, the costs involved for each of your students. I've had questions asked, Momi, we have 504 students who don't who don't have a cost tied to their accommodations. Do we still need to report them on this spreadsheet? And the answer is yes. Until we hear further from board rule, the answer is yes. We need to know all of the 504 students, their disability category, and any financial cost that's tied to the students. And then what I will do is report that statewide, gather all of the reports and present it to the school board in December. And then I have to present to the Education Interim Committee so that they can see the students participating in this program and look at the categories where they qualify within the 9, and then also look at expenditures so that they can be informed as to how much money to allocate for this program. And so our business administrators are asking, you know, when is this report due? It is due on November 10th, as you see here at the bottom. And I'm happy to provide you support, Kevin, and also your principals in answering any detailed questions that you might have. I'm actually thinking about doing another training for business administrators and 504 coordinators, because my first training was done at the end of July, and now that we're in the thick of this and you're gathering data, perhaps there is additional training that needs to be provided. What do you think?
It probably would be a good idea to do that. Since this is a new program, a new report, it might be nice to have more information.
Okay, so, you know, getting your feedback, I'm kind of feeling that way given the emails that I've been receiving. And so I will arrange something and then send that out to 504 coordinators and to the business administrators. Again, the report is due on November 10th, and your LEA has an option to, your district has an option to either report on expenditures from the 2016-17 school year of all of your students, or you can choose to report on expenditure, or your 504 students from July 1st of this year through October 31st. So it's up to you as to which one you need, which one you want to choose to report, and that is updated through or uploaded through UPIPS, and I will give more detailed information on that later to leadership. So sorry I kind of dove into that in greater detail, but I just wanted to inform the importance of your data at the school level that impacts your district's data and expenditures that can give information for funding. Now, you can think about your related services that you're providing to your highly impacted 504 students and think about those costs, and then the benefit that this bill can provide to your school, to your district, and then it trickles down to your school to recoup some of those costs. So your participation in this at the school level is really important to give our legislators a really good informed amount for allocation. Okay.
So could I ask a question there?
Sure.
So for principals, we just get our information to the district and they upload it to you?
Yes, they will have to report it on this spreadsheet that I gave, and then they will also look at the expenditures and include that amount on the spreadsheet. Did you guys want to see that spreadsheet? I can show it to you briefly, but I'm not sure if that's something you needed to see, because it's a report that the district looks at. But yes, at your school site, having that information ready and available to Kevin would certainly help him in this process.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Again, the due date for that is November 10th. This is just a timeline of my support that I'm giving to statewide leadership in training, but I really think that I need to do another live WebEx training to business administrators and 504 coordinators probably within a week's time here, since our due date is November 10th. So I will build that in response to emails and what you're saying, Kevin, as well. So thank you for your feedback. Do I have any questions regarding our new board rule? The board rule is 277-753. If you want to look it up, it gives you greater detail and definitions to each of the 9 category areas, and then the rule regarding the student information system reporting to UTREX and then the expenditure costs reported through UPIPs. Some of you are familiar with UPIPs. It's a secured reporting mechanism that special ed uses. Because this is sensitive information, we are asking that the expenditure report also be uploaded through UPIPs as well. Any questions? Okay, so I already spoke to this part, but I'm giving you a visual regarding the American Disabilities Act and how it's all encompassing, but then we focus on the school setting with Section 504 students in accessing their general education, and that is a distinction that's made in comparison to students on IEPs. And so my expertise is in the Section 504 area. I've had questions come in saying, hey, if a student has an IEP but needs 504 accommodations, do we have to separate the two and do a 504 evaluation? And the answer is no, that a student on an IEP can also receive 504 services, and it's built and written within the IEP itself. But as far as discrimination and access to FAPE, I work closely with the special ed department here because Section 504 does encompass students on IEPs when it comes to discrimination, and discrimination in particular. Access to free, appropriate public education, that is overseen in the special education realm for our IEP students. I've shown this slide before, and this probably looks familiar to you, but the visual really on the graph depicts that there is an increase of complaints being submitted to the Office for Civil Rights, and mainly because our parents and our guardians, advocates for students with disabilities, are becoming more informed, and they are able to access information at their fingertips on the website. And so that's why we see those increased numbers. Do we see those numbers increasing even here at our state office? I've not completed a full year's time in this new position yet, but when talking to Jennifer Slade, who was here prior to me, she has seen the increase in inquiries and complaints at the state office. And as you're aware, usually at the beginning of the school year or at the semester time and towards the end of the school year, that's when we usually see the complaints or inquiries coming in from our parents or advocates statewide. Whoa, what just happened? Let's see.
I'm still good on my end.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that just...
You were on disability-related education complaints?
Okay, let's go again. Now, we are also required to find our children who appear to be impaired for whatever reason. We see this under special education law as well, that if we see a prevalence of absences or chronic illness or inattentiveness that disrupts a student's formal education or even behavior, and you see those patterns, we are obligated to find these children and bring to light that perhaps they need to be evaluated under Section 504. Oftentimes we have a misunderstanding that it's incumbent upon the parents to provide this information before we start the evaluation and eligibility process, and that is not the case under Child Find. We're obligated to do this. When we talk about FAPE, it's an acronym for Free Appropriate Public Education, and this is a provision of educational and related services that we provide without cost to the student with disabilities, nor to the parents or guardians. If I could read this word for word here, except for those fees that are imposed on non-handicapped persons or their parents or guardians. It may consist of either of the provision of free services, or if a recipient places a handicapped person or refers such persons for aid, benefits, or services not operated or provided by the recipient as its means of carrying out the requirements. So recipient refers to the school or the district. And so any related services, even outside of the school, if it's related to the student's 504 and his or her disability in accessing education at your school site, then it should be free to the student. So an example could be, assistive technology. If there's a place that we need to go to acquire that particular device, we will pay for it as a school or a district to provide that access to services for our students. So the criteria for 504 eligibility is making a determination whether the student has a mental or physical impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And so here is a list of some of those. It's not an exhaustive list, but when I click through this part, you're going to see that the list probably got bigger than what you may have seen in the past. And that is due to some changes under the American Disabilities Act, Amendments Act. So here are some examples of what major life activities might look like. I know I went through those slides quite quickly, but again, this is being recorded and you will have access to reviewing the slides at a later time. So that was the first part of Section 504. But then we come to the second and third prongs of this law, where it speaks to students who have a record of such an impairment or is regarded as having an impairment. And these two parts really speak to discrimination. If a student is regarded as having an impairment and we discriminate and we don't allow them to try out for an extracurricular activity or participate, that would be in OCR's definition of a discriminatory practice. Even a student in number 3 regarded as having such an impairment, it may be that, it's just a belief or a rumor, but we treat that student as having an impairment and then we discriminate. Technically, the student could not have an impairment at all, but if there's a belief there and we discourage or we eliminate them from participating in activity, then that would be discriminatory practice. So that's why the prongs 2 and 3 are included under this law as well. Okay. So here are some case studies that I use as a warm-up. So these are case studies where we'll just read this and then we will answer, it's a multiple choice exercise. Then we'll answer the question as we go along. But someone has a question, so here we go.
So an online question, do they not need a diagnosis?
Okay, so very good. The question is, do you need a diagnosis in order to start the 504 process? And the answer is no, mainly no, but I guess it depends on certain cases. But mainly it's no. If a parent comes in and says, hey, I see that my son gets easily distracted and he doesn't follow tasks at home that we ask him to do, and we see that he's getting in trouble here at school. I'm thinking that he might have ADHD. We need to be careful when we say, well, you need to provide a doctor's diagnosis before we can proceed with 504 eligibility determination. Once we say that you need a doctor's diagnosis, we need to pay for those costs. Okay, anytime that we require that a diagnosis be provided, then we cover those costs. Sometimes parents will voluntarily bring a doctor's note in, and the doctor's note is one of the sources that we use in making the determination for eligibility and accommodations, but it's not the sole source. So if a parent volunteers to bring in a diagnosis, of course we can use that in the evaluation. But if for some reason, there are certain observations that we can make in a school setting to determine that a student has an impairment that substantially limits one of those major life activities. Question?
I believe this is an add-on to that question.
Okay.
If we do not see the symptoms at school, do we have to provide a 504 for that student?
I guess that I would need to know in greater detail what that meant, because really I guess I would have to see, because the 504 speaks to access to education in the school setting. And so, that part, if the parent sees the behavior or the impairment at home, but we don't necessarily see it at school, that's a determination that your school team will have to identify. So as a group with the parent and the teachers, the administrator, perhaps the school psychologist or the school counselor, if there are certain assessments, we're including attendance, behavior, not just academic. It's a team's discussion, and then the consideration is made at that point as far as eligibility and then those accommodations. Because when we talk about major life activities, it doesn't stop at the school door. So I'm kind of struggling on that question, because that should impact a student, a person, regardless of the time of day. So if you want to expand on that and email me, I'm happy to. I understand that there are some confidentiality components to the sharing piece from you to me in this setting. So if you'd like to email me a more detailed question, I could try to answer that for you. Okay. So we're looking at some cases here. Here is one. Parents submit a form to the school nurse for the child to receive ADHD medication during the school day. Because of HIPAA laws, the nurse did not alert staff about the student's impairment. The student performed well academically in classes. Teachers described him as a bright young man with a pleasant disposition. However, his disciplinary history revealed multiple infractions for disruptive, defiant, and disrespectful behavior for which he received detention and both in and out of school suspensions. Did the district deny the student free appropriate public education under Section 504 by failing to evaluate him? A, no, the student's disability did not adversely impact his academic performance. B, yes, the student's escalating behavior should have triggered the district's obligation to evaluate him. Or C, no, the parent only requested the administration of medication, not an evaluation.
B.
So what do you think your answer, the correct answer is? Now, these are based on real cases. Okay?
B.
So the answer is yes, the district did deny the student FAPE. The escalating behavior should have triggered the district's obligation to evaluate him. So that's where the child fine comes in. Okay, when we see certain behaviors over a period of time, that should be a red flag saying, okay, what's going on here? Okay. Any questions about this? I'll give you some more information. Sometimes when we make a determination that a student with ADHD is eligible for a 504 plan, sometimes we want to put everything in there and the kitchen sink. And so we just need to be careful that more is better. That mindset could impact how we deliver our services. So we need to be precise. And as a 504 team, that's where the determination is made. And we don't want to over accommodate. And because as it says here, if the one accommodation that the teacher ignores happens to be the one that is absolutely necessary for the student, because there's a whole list, that might be in violation of denying the student FAPE.
Yes, I had a comment on that. On the first page, it said that the school nurse didn't share the information because of HIPAA laws, and actually under FERPA, she should have shared that information because the teachers did have a need to know that information.
Thank you for that clarification. So it's under FERPA that allows the nurse to share that information.
To those who have a need to know, yes. And his teachers certainly did.
Thank you. I need to add that to my slide. So we need to be clear that accommodations are not optional or ideas for teachers to use as needed. And so there's been a prevalence, and you've seen this in your schools, there's an increase in providing accommodations to students with ADHD. And so OCR is seeing those complaints coming through, and throughout their investigation, these are the things that have prevailed. That a consideration of IEP or 504s are viewed as optional. They sometimes schools are dismissing accommodations because the student is doing well academically, and then that we make it incumbent upon the student to ask for the accommodations before we will give it to them. And so these are the findings that OCR has identified that we need to be careful of. Again, students who perform well academically, that should not be the threshold in determining whether or not they're eligible for 504 accommodations. And that, OCR presumes that students with an ADHD diagnosis, now that's with a parent who brings in a diagnosis from the doctor, that the student would be qualified for a 504, okay? Medical assessment is not required, but if it's necessary, the parent should not be charged and the school will cover those costs. If we're looking at RTIs and multiple tier student supports or PBIS, those are good supports to have, but that cannot delay the evaluation process. So in the state of Utah, we follow special education laws here, and the process to evaluate, the timeline is 45 days. Nationwide, under federal laws for sped ed, special education is 60 days. In Utah, it's 45 days. Okay, that is, and in 504 law, it says 504 evaluation should be done in a timely manner. And so timely doesn't give us an exact time frame. So as a best practice, we follow Utah special education timeline of 45 days. Now, there are some exceptions to that, and I will talk about it after Betty Sue presents her part regarding students with medical needs. Additional information on students with ADHD is available at these different links, and you're able to access that. Again, we'll get this PowerPoint out to you at a later time.
Okay.
Okay, the second case study, a 504 student decides to take a live interactive class with a local college in addition to her high school courses at school. The college professor notifies the school in late September that the student had not turned in any assignments yet. The Section 504 coordinator met with the student and told her she needed to work with her college instructors to get support. Question, did this satisfy the school's FAPE obligation in advising the teenager to work with her instructors? A, no, because the student was struggling in her college courses and did not request accommodations. The district should have removed her from the program. B, no, the district should have directly contacted the college's Student Disability Center regarding the student's performance and her need for academic accommodations. Or C, yes, it was not the district's responsibility to ensure the student received accommodations in her college courses. So what is our answer? A, B, or C? The answer is no. The district should have directly contacted the college's Student Disability Center regarding this student on a 504. Now, this is something new, and it just came out last year, so I'm pushing it out statewide. In Iron School District, do you have live interactive classes where students are receiving instruction from a college professor?
We do have some. There's not, we do a lot of the concurrent classes in our schools taught by high school instructors.
Okay.
So,
and so which college do they access?
it's through Southern Utah University. There are still some online courses that are done outside of that, but not as many as that we teach in our own schools.
Okay. So I did a training last week Friday, and the College Disability Center at Utah Valley University, he said that at first I had that the 504 coordinator at the school district or at the school site should contact the professor, but he said it's actually better to contact the disability center at the college, because then they're able to look at the 504 and then write up the college appropriate accommodations, and they can do. I said, give me a timeline, because we're talking about students, already taking the class from the professor, and they said the turnaround time should be within a week because the 504 is already written out. And then the 504 that we use is at the high school or the public school setting, but they can look at that and provide the accommodations at the college setting written for the professor. So that's some information I wanted to share with you. And here are the sources that you can look to regarding dual enrolled students. There's a parent and educator resource guide that's found at this link here on this slide. I wanted to have our Utah USBE guide out to you before the training today, but there's a lot of different things that we're looking at. We've got a lot of feedback on the forms, because I believe this is what you're using at your site as administrators in your schools. You're looking at the forms, you're looking at procedures in the evaluation process. And so we're updating all of that, given the feedback statewide, and we should have it to you by this month. Once I get that handbook done and okayed, we also need to make it ADA accessible when we put it on our website. But our timeline is still firm that we'll have it done this month, and I will push it out to the 504 coordinators, who will also give you the link at your school where you can access this resource. Right now at your school site and even at the district site, you're using the 2015 handbook, correct?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to skip that about charter schools, only to let you know that charter schools are obligated to all of the standards and the compliance um, uh, duties of our school districts as well. This is just a brief Office for Civil Rights Dear Colleague letter regarding physical restraint and how when it's supposed to be used and when it's not supposed to be used. And this is when the child's behavior poses imminent danger of serious physical harm to self or others. We support the same language in our Utah board rule. And so you'll want to look at your school district's policy regarding least restricted behavioral interventions so that they align with our state and our federal, our state rule and Office for Civil Rights in regards to students with disabilities. Now, we know, and if you didn't know this, students who are abusing drugs, while they're in the period of drug abuse, they are not eligible for any sort of 504 evaluation or the process or services. But that should be a red flag that when a student is off of abusing drugs, there's a reason for that. And so we need to look deeper. It doesn't wash our hands clean of addressing the student under 504 if that is appropriate. Sometimes abusing drugs is a coping mechanism to something much deeper. And so the Office for Civil Rights came out and said, hey, okay, we see that there is a high abuse of, specific to opioids, that we need to dig a little bit deeper to see if there are impairments affecting the student, and that should be a red flag in identifying an impairment or disability and evaluating the student if he or she is eligible. Okay. Again, free is very important, that when we require parents to come on a field trip to watch their child who is receiving 504 services, that is something that we shouldn't do unless a parent volunteers, right? If a student has a disability that impacts him or her during the school year where they need to access summer school, then that could be considered extended services, and the access to summer school also might look like it should be free to that student. Okay, if the disability impacts his or her learning during the school year, consider extended, services throughout the summer where it's at no cost to the student or the parent.
Some of their names.
Any question about that? I thought I heard somebody's voice.
Okay, I can do that.
Okay. I'll go through this quickly, and then where do we? This slide basically says that a parent notified a principal that they suspect that their child has a disability, and the school has that 45-day window to evaluate the student. At that same time, if disciplinary issues come up, that student is still protected, where we need to be mindful of suspensions or a student being expelled from school. That student is considered under that prong of regarded as having a disability, that they should have full protection during the evaluation process. And so we need to make sure that we're mindful of our students, especially when it triggers behaviors while we're evaluating them, that they are still able to access their schooling, their education. Okay, so this is a question that has come up. What if a parent revokes special education services and then requests for a 504 evaluation for accommodations? And so we see that court cases are split, but here's the distinction that I want to make. That, and here's the example here. A mother refuses services under IDEA to place her son on a part-time special day class, but is requesting 504 accommodations for assistive technology to address her child's hearing impairment. Does the 504 team convene a meeting to determine eligibility and accommodations? Office for Civil Rights says yes. The 504 team conducts an evaluation to determine disability threshold for eligibility and accommodations. Although the parent rejected the IDEA or special education services for learning in the educational context, the access to FAPE according to the child's impaired hearing requires the school to provide assistive technology under 504 and Title II. Okay, so yes, we would have to provide services under 504, but when do we not? Here's the other case. Parents withdrew IDEA consent in having their daughter placed in a school for severely handicapped children and requested for 504 accommodations in a general education setting. Is the 504 team required to provide accommodations? And in this court case, the answer is no. The court pointed out that the parents' allegations were educational in nature, including the placement decision and the transition services. So a parent may not bypass special education services and their procedures in voluntarily revoking consent under IDEA and then asking for the same accommodations under Section 504. Okay, so there's that distinction. When it's educational in nature under special education services, when the parent revokes that and asks for those accommodations under 504, we don't do that. Okay, so I'm going to transition now to Betty Sue, and she will provide training for school nurses and for 504 site administrators as well. Betty Sue.
Okay, so this is my contact information if anybody needs to get a hold of me. The school nurses already have that information, but I am available to help with any questions. So that's how you get a hold of me. So the school nurse does have a role in Section 504. They assist in identifying students who may need services. They need to develop an IHP or an emergency action plan based on a nursing assessment, which is a nursing function. They can recommend the health-related accommodations. They can provide the training to the staff on any accommodations or individual health needs. And then they need to provide training and supervision to the unlicensed assistive personnel, who I may refer to as UAPs, on any specialized healthcare services that may be needed for the student. So this is a statement from the National Association of School Nurses that says, the school nurse is an essential member of the team participating in the identification and evaluation of students who may be eligible for services through the implementation of Section 504 and IDEA. So we have the school nurse's practice is governed by the Nurse Practice Act, which is on the left, and then the Nurse Practice Act rules, which is on the right. Excuse me, and each one is separate and important. And everything that a school nurse does is based on what the Nurse Practice Act and the rules permit. There are medication laws also that govern what a school nurse needs to do and train staff to do in the school. And this is the reference for the medication law that says that that allows for employee volunteers to administer medication, but there does have, it also says that it is required to have a written authorization form signed by the parent and the licensed healthcare provider that it's medically appropriate in the school. And this doesn't differentiate between over-the-counter medications or prescription medications. It just says medications. The next section of that law talks about asthma medications, which allows students to possess and self-carry or self-administer medication. But again, sometimes parents forget this second part, that they do have to have the written authorization from the parent and the licensed healthcare provider that it's medically appropriate for that medication to be in the schools. The next section talks about glucagon, next section of that medication law. Pardon me, got a frog in my throat. And it requires the schools to identify and train volunteer school employees to administer the glucagon, which is an emergency medication for students with diabetes. Again, after receiving the same authorization or a similar, that has the same information, that the parents have to sign that they want it done, and the healthcare provider has to sign that it's medically necessary. The next section of the medication law refers to seizure rescue medications. And this one gets a little bit tricky because it talks about the schools requiring to identify and train volunteer school staff to administer the rescue medication, but there are some criteria that need to be met. The parent must have previously administered the medication in a non-clinical setting, so outside the hospital, and the student must have ceased having a full-body, prolonged, or convulsive seizure activity due to the medication, and no side effects to the medication. What gets tricky about this is when you can't find school employee volunteers, and so sometimes we have to look at the federal laws that trump the state laws on this. The state law being it has to be a volunteer, but the federal laws, thank you, have to be, we have to provide those accommodations. Okay, the next section talks about diabetes medication and supplies, and this is a possession and self-administration. So this permits a student to possess and self-administer diabetes medication, but again, they must have the proper written authorization from the parent and the licensed health care provider that it's medically appropriate. The next section of the law talks about the epinephrine or emergency for anaphylaxis or severe seizures. This law requires that, and it's in a different section, so 26-41-101, requires all public and private schools to have at least one, and EAI is emergency or epinephrine auto injector. So, and the schools can obtain those. There are two major companies that produce this medication. One is the EpiPen and the other is an AviQ. And each school, the two companies that produce those medications have provided free resources to schools, and the school nurses can help with that process to get those auto injectors in the school. The same law allows a student to possess and self-administer that medication, but again, they must have the written authorization from the parent and the licensed healthcare provider that it's medically appropriate to carry those or to have them in the school. And then typically it would be kept, depending on where the parent and the licensed healthcare provider determine, it may be kept in the office, and the teacher may keep it in their desk. The student may carry it. It's all determined on the individual healthcare plan or the emergency action plan for the anaphylaxis where it would be kept. For example, a kindergarten student may not be able to self-administer that medication, or even an older student, if they're having an anaphylactic reaction, may not be able to self-administer. But if they have it, it's important that the school staff that's been trained on administering this epinephrine know where that device is. There are rules that are set up for the school health office. There must be a clinic room provided. It must have a cot or a bed. The room must have hot and cold running water, soap, a lockable cabinet for first aid supplies, and each school must have at least 2 individuals on site who have CPR and first aid training. I know of some districts who have tried to get around that by saying they have an AED and have trained staff on that. That is not the same thing. Each school must have at least 2 individuals on site who have CPR and first aid training, and AED being the automated external defibrillator, which is a good device to have in each of the schools, but it doesn't take the place of the CPR and the first aid training. This rule also states that medication must be kept secure. It may not always require being locked, but it needs to be in a secured refrigerator, cabinet, or drawer. And this rule also states that school bus drivers must be CPR and first aid trained. We have questions. I get questions all the time. Do schools have to have a school nurse? Well, the law does not say that there has to be a school nurse in every school. What the law states is students may be better protected if schools were to have registered nurses readily available, and that districts are encouraged to have 1 RN for every 5,000 students. But that is not nearly enough. We're working on a staffing recommendation at the moment, the Utah Department of Health, to get more nurses in the school because there's so many responsibilities. And based on the Nurse Practice Act, it has to be a registered nurse that writes the IHP or the Individual Healthcare Plan or the Emergency Action Plan. So if a school nurse is a related service that's needed in order for a student to access FAPE, then it becomes a requirement under Section 504. And just so everybody knows, an IHP cannot take the place of a Section 504 plan. They're 2 separate documents. So I've already kind of alluded to this. Who can write an IHP, an individual health care plan? And that is a nursing responsibility. If somebody else does that in place of the nurse, there can be other plans of care, but the IHP is defined as a nursing standard, a nursing responsibility, a nursing function. And so a lot of times, let me go back, a lot of times, especially with charter schools, which this doesn't really affect at the moment in your particular district, but sometimes a charter school will contract with an outside nurse or even use a parent who is an RN to do this function. So in order for a school nurse to provide or delegate care, there has to be, if it's a medication that needs to be delegated to an unlicensed staff, then there has to be a medication order. And then for the DMMO, that's a diabetes medication management order, or the SMMO is a seizure medication management order. If there's a procedure that needs to be done, for example, a student with spina bifida may need to be catheterized, then there needs to be an order for that. Essentially, whenever there's an invasive procedure that needs to be done or delegated to an unlicensed assistive personnel, there needs to be an order from a physician. The nurse can't just, the parent can't just say, this needs to be done, and the nurse needs to train the person. There has to be documentation for that in order for the nurse to delegate that care appropriately. So either the medication order or the procedure order. And occasionally in our emergency action plans, we have that order combined with the healthcare plan. For example, our anaphylaxis or our asthma healthcare plans or emergency action plans have the order combined with that form. The state of the Utah Department of Health has developed those particular forms. And then the LEA, your district may have a policy that further restricts that other requirements that might be necessary. So in some cases, your district may require separate medication authorization for routine or even emergency medications. So that would be up to your LEA. It can be included with your, for example, a student with anaphylaxis may just turn in the state form, the emergency action plan. But if your district also requires that any medication administered needs to have your district medication authorization, then that would be defined in your medication policy. The same thing with procedures, catheterization or tube feeding. Again, if it's a tube feeding, that's an invasive procedure. You're putting something into that student's body, so you would need a procedure, an order for that. Diabetes care also needs the order because you are helping with managing that student's medication. So that's something that would need, at a minimum, a medication authorization and should have a health care plan and or an emergency action plan in place before that care can be provided or delegated to an unlicensed person. Oops. So IHP, let's go into that a little bit more, is the Individualized Healthcare Plan. And it's a little bit different from the Emergency Action Plan. The IHP is typically written by and for the school nurse, and it follows the ADPI, which is the nursing process of assessing, diagnose, plan, implement, and evaluate the care that needs to be given to that student. It's a detailed plan, and typically the healthcare provider and the parents don't need to sign that, but occasionally nurses will ask that those be signed, and it could be several pages depending on the student's diagnosis. Now, most of what we see in Utah would be an emergency action plan, and this is written by the school nurse with input from the parent and physician, and it's kind of usually in a format that's if you see this, do this kind of thing. It's very simplified, typically 1 to 2 pages. We do like to have parent signature on that, and if it is combined with an order as our anaphylaxis and asthma ones are, it will need a physician's signature. So according to the Nurse Practice Act and rules, there are some unprofessional conduct definitions in there, and one thing is that non-licensed staff cannot say they are a nurse. This is a third-degree felony with up to an $8,000 fine, and so if you happen to have, and I'm not sure that you do down in your district, but there's some districts where they hire health clerks to assist the school nurse. That health clerk cannot call themselves the school nurse, or they are in violation of that unprofessional conduct. Another one that the nurses are often concerned about is the unlawful or inappropriate delegation of nursing care by the nurse, and this is for the nurse to determine. So what's inappropriate, what's unlawful, it has to be supervised by the nurse, and the nurse has to be the one that determines whether it's appropriate or not. But there are some protections written into most of the laws that say a registered nurse who, in reliance on the school's policies or delegation rule, delegates or trains an unlicensed assistive person to administer medication shall not be considered to have engaged in unprofessional conduct or inappropriate delegation. So there are some protections written in for the nurse for most of the medication laws. And is this you or me?
Well, we can share this, but you know, when we talk about students with medical needs, you know, especially when a parent first learns, for example, that their child has diabetes, and so you know, with them learning and entrusting the care of their child in a school setting, the emotions are high, and you've probably witnessed that at your school. And so what they're learning from what they're reading on their website or what they're hearing among groups of, you know, advocates, they may come in with specific requests separate from the doctor's orders and making these requests. Well, it's still, you want to consider what the parent is requesting. If your school district has something equivalent to what the parent is requesting, but equivalent to that in providing that accommodation to the student, it's, as long as you are following your procedures at the school, that would be appropriate. So, you know, we know that parents' emotions are elevated, especially when a diagnosis is new. And so balancing that, taking that into consideration while also looking at the accommodations that you can provide is a correct way to go. Of course, that word unreasonable, that's based on different perspectives, but we, of course, want to address what the parents are requesting while also looking at what we can provide that is equivalent to their request. This question here, but before I go to the second part, as Betty Sue was presenting, I I wanted to ask you at the school site, as a 504 site administrator, have you had the conversation with your school nurse regarding students with individual health plans? Have you engaged in that conversation and providing clarity that under FERPA you're able to access that information? If you could do that and provide that collaboration where information can be passed back and forth, then of course we're working in a concerted effort for the benefit of the student. It doesn't mean that all IHP serviced student qualifies or needs a 504 accommodation plan, but certainly that is a step towards making that consideration. And so building that communication line with your school nurse is definitely something that we encourage, so that we're not missing any students that might need those accommodations.
Momi?
I've had questions where, can we attach the individual health plan to the 504 and call it good? Betty Sue just said that the IHP is written by the nurse for the nurse. So we can certainly add that to our documentation, but the accommodation piece is how do we crosswalk what the nurse has on her individual health plan to make it usable for the teacher in the classroom. So if it is that a student needs to leave at certain times of the day to self-administer insulin, and that's written in the IHP, well then in the 504 accommodation plan, the teacher knows to excuse the student at certain times of the day without being disciplined for being tardy or absent during an activity. So you want to make it the plan usable for your teacher in the classroom setting. If a physician refuses to write a note, order, or recommendations for accommodations to be made at the school by the parent's request, does the school still have to include the parent's request in the Section 504 plan? If there are medical procedures being delegated, definitely the physician still is required to write that order before that delegation can occur. But if it's outside of that parameter in administering medication, then we can consider it as a 504 team in providing additional accommodations for the student. Are schools allowed to ask for a physician's recommendations or orders before signing a Section 504 plan? You probably would want to go with the direction that the parent wants to go, because I've seen where parents don't necessarily want that physician's input regarding accommodations, and then I see that parents want the physician to include recommended accommodations. There again, we use the physician's recommendations as one of the sources when determining the accommodations as a 504 team. It's not the sole source for accommodations. Because you are the experts in the school setting, and that's the key part there. You as a 504 team, you are recognizing the impairment and you're determining the accommodations in the school setting. So you as a team, you are the experts to make that determination. Then we've had questions about students with peanut allergies, and do we say as a school, are we peanut free? Is that the right language to use? We just need to be cautious about saying, okay, our classroom or our school is peanut free, because once we do that, we're guaranteeing that there's absolutely no traces of peanut, anything, proteins at the school site. And that's something I would say that we cannot guarantee. And while at the same time, the Office for Civil Rights, they recognize that we cannot guarantee a sterile environment that's peanut free. So if we say that we are peanut aware and that we're providing certain practices in the classroom setting or in the lunchroom, then we are okay. If we want to designate a table that is peanut free, then that would be appropriate if we are ensuring that within that isolated location. So just to be aware of that. If you need additional information and recommendations in how to make your school, your classroom, your lunchroom peanut aware, email me and I can get that out, the additional information out to you. Then hand sanitizer for allergies. Using hand sanitizer actually does not work to clean peanut residue and most allergens from our hands. So we need our students and our faculty to wash our hands with water and soap when we have a student with allergies who need this type of accommodation. Do I have any questions about this? Okay. Okay, I think I talked about these pieces here, bullets 1, 2, and 3, but the fourth one, this is kind of a side note. What about students who lack proper immunizations and sent home? Did you want to answer that question?
The state law requires all students to be adequately immunized or be in the process of being adequately immunized, being conditional, which means they've had one shot in the series and it's not time for the next shot. For example, hepatitis A needs to have 6 months between the two. So they need to be either compliant, conditional, or have an exemption on file. And those students that do not have that after a certain period of time and notification of the parents, according to state law, have to be excluded from attending school. This gets a little bit tricky with our special ed students because sometimes parents might think they're being excluded based on their disability, and that is not the case. It is based on their immunization status. And so the school nurse needs to work, or whoever manages the immunizations for your district needs to work with the parent on ensuring that all students have the proper immunizations or exemption forms on file. Or they could, by law, be sent home and not allowed to attend until they do provide that information.
Thank you. You remember towards the beginning when I talked about that 45-day window to evaluate a student? We follow that as a best practice. There are cases where, however, where a student has medical needs and a doctor's order is provided. When we collaborate with our nurse and we understand, okay, there's a doctor's order for a student with diabetes, we don't need to take, when we say reasonable, then we already know that there's a diagnosis that's made. We don't necessarily need to extend to the 45 days. That could potentially make us liable for not addressing the 504 accommodations in a reasonable timeline. And so that's something we need to be aware of. If the orders are in, we've received the information from the school nurse, the consideration for a 504 evaluation for eligibility, that timeline for that particular student actually would look shorter, okay? And so we need to be mindful of that so that we can more immediately address the needs of the student impacting his or her absences or tardies, where they are still able to access their education without penalty, an extension in their assignments or taking their tests, or even the term ending at a particular point, that should be removed so that the term is extended for that student to complete his or her education within that time frame. So these are some of the things that we look and consider and balance out in a 504 plan that I wanted to share with you as well. Again, many, if not all, students with diabetes should qualify under Section 504. We don't consider mitigating measures while they have the pump that automatically, provides the student measures and provides the student insulin. So we don't need to make the consideration. We still need to make the consideration for eligibility under 504. Okay. Now here's a form that we have.
Can I ask a question about that?
Sure.
So some of these conditions that exist, but so I guess it's a child find question. What if we know those conditions exist, there's a healthcare plan in place, it's being appropriately addressed and the parent hasn't asked for that? Do we need to go out and try and create a 504 for every student that has any one of those conditions?
You would want to consider that, and that could be a conversation you initially have with the parents. But yeah, in each situation, it's unique. But certainly looking at the students and seeing how they're able to access their education, looking at different assessments, behavior, attendance. How they're able to, learn in the classroom setting. But yes, we want you to take that into consideration and bring that up as perhaps a proposal to teachers and to parents. Sometimes parents will say, no, that's not necessary. He's receiving his needs through the individual health plan, and that's all we need. But then some parents are not informed and they see that their child is impacted for whatever reason, where maybe he's being penalized for late assignments, or because the teacher's not aware of his or her needs. So that you'd want to bring that up with teachers and parents. You want to inform the parents of a possibility to be eligible under Section 504. Did you want to add to that too, Betty Sue? Or
I think it's a good idea for them, for at least your 504 coordinator, to be aware of those students with diabetes. I think what Momi said is correct. Some students may not need accommodations, but I think it's a good idea or good practice to make sure parents are aware that they do qualify for it. Students with diabetes and their families are very well connected with other families with diabetes, and so they talk and they're probably already aware that they qualify for that. But there may be some who are not connected, maybe a newly diagnosed that isn't aware of that, or somebody who was diagnosed as an infant who's now in high school and hasn't kept up with other parents, but may need some specific accommodations for attendance or whatever testing reasons. And so I think it's a great idea to just reach out to the parents and see. Again, it's all individualized. We have to remember that individualized part of it, and some students may need it and some may not.
here's a form that schools can use to make a determination for a 504 evaluation. We have this available as well. I don't think we have this available we do have it available in our latest handbook. The formatting looks a little bit different. But this is what you can use as a 504 site administrator to determine, the need for the student to be evaluated for Section 504. Okay. Here's some guidelines from the American Diabetes Association regarding how students with diabetes are impacted, and what we can do to provide supports, basic training to all staff, the leadership and responsibilities delegated by the school nurse, when it is appropriate or not appropriate for self-management to occur with the student. Here are some practices that we want to avoid. That we isolate the student's eligibility for 504 accommodations solely on the student's learning or their grades. They're doing really well in school, so maybe we shouldn't consider it. Many of our students with disabilities, they compensate for their impairment or disability, where they spend an increased, in comparison to non-disabled students, amount of homework and being able to complete it. It looks different for a student who's impaired. And so we shouldn't use learning as the determination for eligibility, solely learning as the determination for eligibility under Section 504. We also need to be careful that we don't identify one school as the diabetes school for whatever reason, that there's equipment available at that school, or the nurse is assigned to that school, that we're not discriminating the access piece for our students when we designate one school or a couple of schools as the school where our students with diabetes attend. We need to make sure that, well, I want to make sure that that's correct.
That's correct, yeah.
Having no one available to administer insulin and glucagon at the school site, expecting the parent to be responsible for the student's care during field trips and extracurricular activities. Again, we do have parents who volunteer, especially our parents who are newly informed that their child has diabetes. So their safety in trusting their student in the school, they might want to volunteer. And if they do, and if it's okay for the school to allow the parent to attend, that's your decision to make. But requiring that a parent be there for their student on field trips or extracurricular activities would be inappropriate to ask. And then prohibiting a student, if it's determined that the student can self-manage medication determined by the nurse, then it should be allowed. And then number 6, substituting a doctor's order or an IHP for a Section 504 plan, again, that can be included, but the plan and accommodations need to be written for the teachers in the classroom setting or the school setting. Okay. Can districts choose out of evaluating a student for a Section 504 plan when they have an IEP? It's not a substitute for completing a 504 evaluation, and we've discussed that on several times. Okay. Oh, do you want to talk about that?
Sure. So insulin pump site changes. So students that have diabetes, a lot of them have insulin pumps. And those pumps are connected to them via a tube. Then that pump site, the tube, is changed typically every 3 days or so. And that should be done at home. It should not be something that's required at school. Because of it being every 3 days, the parent can easily manage that at home. However, sometimes the tubing can become kinked or clogged or dislodged, and so we call that pump failure. And so there has to be a plan in place for those emergencies for all students who have diabetes that are on a pump. So what do we do when that pump site fails? You can request, but not require, that a parent come in to change that site. If the student is independent, you can allow them to change the site. A student that might just need minimal assistance, for example, holding their arm steady while they put the site in, is appropriate. The school nurse can change the site, but only if they are trained on it and if they're in that location. And then this is the plan that is in most cases. So if there's a pump failure, then there can be insulin can be administered via either syringe and vial or a pen, insulin pen, until the site can be changed. But again, there must be some sort of a plan in place for these emergencies, because the insulin can become, if the insulin is not being delivered, the pump delivers insulin at a steady basal rate, and if that pump site fails, then the student's blood glucose can go very high very quickly. And so you must have some sort of a plan in place on how to manage that student's diabetes. In the meantime, you can't just ignore that. Something has to be done to help that student's blood glucose stay in a safe range. So one of those options right there should be written into the emergency care plan on what to do for a pump failure.
Thank you.
So again, this next one, can nurses delegate diabetes care? Well, it depends. The Nurse Practice Act does specifically allow for delegation of the glucagon, which again is the emergency medication. That's for high blood glucose, very high blood glucose. And it also allows for a scheduled dose of insulin. But then it also states that a nurse cannot delegate medication with known frequent side effects that can be life-threatening, and insulin certainly does qualify for that. So all medication or any medication that requires a nursing assessment before and after administration is something that can't be delegated. So as I mentioned before, it's up to the individual nurses to determine if they can or can't delegate. And some districts have chosen not to have insulin delegated to unlicensed staff. They have nurses that come in, or their school nurses are the only ones that can administer it. But again, that accommodation has to be made. The student that cannot manage their own diabetes has to have somebody who can give that insulin to it. And it's just, the question is it going to be a nurse or is it going to be an unlicensed delegated staff?
Okay, we're segueing into just some parts of the presentation that speaks overall to the handbook, and then your policies and procedures at the district level. Again, this revised handbook for the state of Utah should be out this month. This will include the Utah law, the board rule. It'll include some links to the Office for Civil Rights, Dear Colleague letters. If you're not aware of Dear Colleague letters and what they do, is basically, as a nation, when they see a practice that is done nationwide where the Office for Civil Rights needs to provide clarity, they write this Dear Colleague letter and then they send it out nationwide. And so this year we've had letters about ADHD, ADD students. We've had it on physical restraint. We've had a letter go out on, I want to say it's for charter schools as well. And then the Dear Colleague came out with the parent and educator guidelines. And we've adopted a lot of the guidelines and case studies within our handbook. Feedback from you and other coordinators statewide was that if you could give us some case studies, then we can see how that could apply to some of the scenarios that we're seeing at our site as well. So we're including those. My laptop is saying that it's running out of juice.
Here, you can have mine.
Okay. There we go. I just need to turn that server on. Thank you. This is what you need to have at your school site and at the district level on your school website and in your student and parent handbooks. Do you have a written non-discrimination assurance posted? We have a designated 504 coordinator at your district. Do you have policies and procedures for grievance procedures and due process at your site? If a parent has a complaint, is there a timeline where the school addresses the complaint, and if they still want to appeal it at the district level, what does that timeline look like so that you're informed, you can inform the parents of this process? We support at Utah State Board of Education that clarification or correction or additional training take place at the local level, and we support that because the response is more immediate than if a complaint came to us, and especially to the Office for Civil Rights. And so having those policies, not just having the policies and procedures in place, but knowing about them and providing it in a written format to your parents and students and articulating that to them is vital, so that they understand that clarifications in perhaps misunderstanding or miscommunication can be immediately addressed at the local level. We also recognize that sometimes your parents will call us for clarification. You need to know that we will always call and talk to your 504 coordinator to ask for clarifications, and sometimes we mediate a conversation, but we still like to see that the clarifications done at the local level. We also know that if a complaint comes to us, that we will sometimes write it out and we'll receive a response from you, and then we will inform both you and the complainant of the outcome. Likewise, that takes place at the district level as well with your 504 coordinator. With Kevin, he will look at a concern or a complaint that comes to him, and he knows to inform you as a school as well as a parent of the outcome. In our 504 laws, it doesn't give you an exact timeline in when 504 should be updated. It says that it should be updated or addressed on a regular basis. And again, we follow IDEA practice where we visit the accommodation every year to see, we can give parents a call to see if, and teachers to see if the accommodation is still appropriate or additional considerations need to be made. But then every 3 years, it would be a best practice that we reevaluate the student to address current needs that he or she might have. This is what a notice looks like. This is just a sample. You can adopt it and put it on your website or in your handbooks. It requires that we have contact information available as well. I've seen school districts where they have a non-discrimination notice, but it is all-encompassing, even with race, ethnicity, country of origin, or sex of the student. That is a non-discrimination sort of umbrella that covers all different protected classes. As long as the 504 coordinator contact information is also available to that type of non-discrimination notice, that would be okay. But those are just some examples. I've already spoken to this part of the 504 coordinator's responsibilities, and this is something that you can go back to. So we do have this collaborative support that that goes back and forth between me and the 504 coordinators. I also want to invite site administrators, if you are interested in joining my listserv, let me know. We'll get you hooked up. And that's something that I push out information, updated information on a regular basis. Sometimes I do pop quizzes just to keep us informed in what current issues are happening nationwide regarding 504. So if you're interested in that, I'll give you my email at the end of this, and you can also join the listserv. This is just an example of a grievance procedure that can be adopted, but you might already have a timeline that you've articulated at your district regarding the due process. But here's an example of the grievance procedures. Procedural, I kind of went backwards. I went down to the grievance procedures, but I also wanted to say that when we have our 504 team meetings, that we need to provide the procedural safeguards in a paper format to our parents. And also it needs to include information in how they can access the Office for Civil Rights as well. I have a sample procedural safeguards handout, and if you visited me on our USBE website, you probably are having a hard time accessing these documents. I will show you where you can go to open and download those documents. And while I'm looking for that, Amanda, on our USBE website, do we have some of those handouts already available, including the procedural safeguards? It's parents' rights, and it's provided in English as well as in Spanish.
Yes, parents' rights are up and available, as well as your district coordinators, and several other, we've got updated recently.
Okay, so what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to show you how you can access these documents on the Utah State Board of Education website. If you type in the URL schools.utah.gov, this screen should come up. And then when you go down to departments and programs right here, you click on that link, and you will want to go to E for equity, but that's not where I'm found. You need to go to School Counseling, Equity, and Prevention under the letter S. You click on that link, and then you click on School Counseling, Equity, and Prevention again, and there you'll find me under Educational Equity. We have different tabs in the Equity Department. The Section 504 tab is where you want to go. And here are some handouts that you can download and provide for your parents and guardians. Equal Rights for All Students, a Parent Guide to Section 504. And it's also written in Spanish down below. You want to include your district's timeline regarding the grievance procedures, and ensure that your parents know about or have this information on hand. Okay. Okay. So it's here in English, and it's also available in Spanish. There's a lot of other resources that are available on the site. We've had some hiccups because we needed to make all of our documents ADA accessible. So I'm happy to report that we have most of our 504 documents available. Okay. Where was I? Again, when we draw upon a variety of resources, that's included in the evaluation process. We want to make sure that we document and consider pieces of information. When we have our 504 team, it's a team of people. It's not designated to just one person, We have a site administrator, parents, school teacher, and whatever school personnel that's needed to be included in this process. We want to ensure that our students are placed in a regular educational setting with the aids and related services. Again, these are just samples that I've already spoken to at the beginning of our presentation. The big part that you probably go to in the handbook is the examples of disabilities and recommended accommodations that go along with that. We have added the underlined impairments or disabilities have been added to the handbook based on what we have in board rule and what you've asked for us to provide in the field. If there are additional needs and you see that it's prevalent and it's not included here, let me know and I will try to add that to this handbook. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Let me know. So this is a process for the 504 process and the forms that go along with it. Each of these bulleted features is also provided in a form, as a form in the handbook. This is the conclusion of our presentation. I know we have a few minutes here. If anyone has questions that you would like for us to entertain at this moment, we're happy to try to answer those. So I'll just be quiet here for a minute and entertain some questions that you might have.
Momi, this is Kevin Garrett. Where can we find this recording? I know I have some individuals who wanted to listen to that, but will you provide the link to us?
Yes, almost immediately after the recording, Jerry Record, our media specialist, will give me the link and then I can send it out to you, Kevin, and then you can push it out to the field.
That would be great.
Jerry Record is coming in to the studio and I think he has something he wants to say.
I actually upload our videos to the YouTube site now.
Okay.
So if you go to our homepage, there's a YouTube link.
I'll just send them a link in the chat.
Okay. So Amanda is...
But it will actually take a few hours to get it uploaded. We do that for captioning purposes.
That's right. Okay, so if you didn't hear that, Jerry Record says that we have a USBE YouTube site. Amanda right now is including that YouTube site address in the chat. So you should be able to see it right now, Kevin.
Yeah.
And it'll take Jerry a couple of hours to upload it. The reason why we're using YouTube now is so that it shows closed captioning. But then you probably have the question about the slides here. I will give it to Amanda and she will send it to you. Right after we're done with this meeting, I'll actually still leave the meeting open. Amanda, can you send it as an attachment within the chat?
Not within the chat.
Okay.
We'll need to send them an email.
So we'll send it to you, Kevin, via email.
Okay, that'd be great.
There is, here is my contact information with my email address. I should actually include my my phone number on this. It is 801-538-7828, where you can call me. And even if I'm not at my desk, I do receive your messages via email, your voice message, and I can address your questions either by calling you back or by email. And then like I said earlier, we have the resources available on our USBE website. We also have a UEN toolkit website that it's a bit easier to navigate through, and this is something that you can give to parents as well. And I think I counted 5 different clicks when you go to the USBE website, but here if you click on the link provided in the PowerPoint, you can go straight to section 504. One click and you're able to see the parent guide, the same guide that I showed you from the USBE website, the timeline for college and career readiness from grade to grade and from high school to post-secondary education, the role of the school nurse, how to file a complaint with the Office for Civil Rights, how to file an inquiry or complaint to USBE, how parents can access support through the Utah Parent Center. So this might be something that you want to provide to your schools and to your parents and guardians as well. I have also provided a link here for those of you who want to join the listserv. You can either email me and say, hey, Momi, I want to join the listserv, or you can go straight to this link and register yourself. Either way, it's up to you. And I try not to send a ton of emails out because I know you have a lot of emails coming to you already. So, you know, usually it's 1 or 2 emails a month that I send out, unless we're in reporting season and you're asking me to, if I see more than 10 principals or 504 coordinators emailing me on one question that's common, I usually push that out, because if there's at least 10 that are asking, there's many more out there that need clarification on specific items. So anyway, I thank you for participating in this 504 training. Unless I have any other questions, that is the conclusion of this training today. And thank you, Kevin, for providing this time that we can connect with your administrators as well.
No, it's been great information. Thank you very much for doing this for us.
And again, you know, I want to be a continued resource, and I know Betty does too. So we know that training happens, but real life happens too in the school setting. And sometimes we have unique questions, and we want to, we make ourselves available to answer those questions. And I want to give kudos to Iron School District. You guys are our flagship district where we've done this training this way specific for a district. So, you know, we're going to encourage other districts to engage in this as well, saying that, hey, Iron School District did this, so, and it seemed to have worked out, and so we want to provide it to others too. So thanks for participating.
We've had a few glitches on our end. I think some of the sound didn't come through, but I think that's certainly from our computers. It's been perfect for coming from you guys, so thank you.
Thanks so much. Have a good day. We'll
You
talk
too.
to you later.